In the marshlands between Maryland and Delaware, where state lines blurred and law enforcement was scarce, stood a tavern that would become synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The year was 1829, and few who entered Patty Cannon's establishment would live to tell their tale. This is not just another crime story from America's dark past. This is the account of a woman who turned human trafficking into an art form, who hunted people like wild game, and who built an empire of terror that would shock a nation already torn by the horrors of slavery. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about evil. How does an ordinary woman become a predator so ruthless that even hardened criminals feared her name? How does someone transform their home into a killing ground while maintaining the facade of respectability? The answers lie in the twisted life of Patty Cannon, a woman whose crimes were so heinous that they would inspire horror stories for generations to come. Patricia Patty Cannon arrived at Johnson's Corner sometime in the early 1800s, settling in a ramshackle tavern that straddled the border between Caroline County, Maryland, and Sussex County, Delaware. To travelers passing through this desolate stretch of marshland, her establishment appeared to be nothing more than a rough but necessary stop on their journey. The building itself was unremarkable, weathered wooden planks, a sagging roof, and windows that seemed to absorb light rather than let in. But Patty Cannon was far from ordinary. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with piercing dark eyes and graying hair that she kept severely pulled back, she commanded attention the moment she entered a room. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and her physical strength was legendary among the locals. Stories circulated of her single-handedly restraining grown men and throwing troublemakers out of her tavern with ease. The location of her tavern was no accident. Johnson's Corner sat precisely on the state line, a geographic quirk that would prove crucial to her criminal enterprise. When law enforcement from Maryland came looking for her, she could simply step across her threshold into Delaware. When Delaware authorities arrived, she was technically in Maryland. This jurisdictional nightmare would protect her for years, allow her crimes to escalate without interference. The tavern served as the perfect front for her operations. Legitimate travelers would stop for food and lodging, providing cover for her more sinister activities. The isolated location meant that screams wouldn't be heard, and the marshy terrain surrounding the building made it an ideal place to dispose of evidence. The basement of the tavern, which Patty claimed was used for storing supplies, would later be discovered to hold far darker secrets. Local residents began to notice disturbing patterns. Travelers who stopped at Patty's tavern had a tendency to disappear, their horses and belongings somehow ending up in Patty's possession. When questioned, she would claim they had sold their animals to settle their bills and continued their journey on foot. Free African Americans who had been traveling north would vanish without a trace, only to be spotted weeks later in chains, heading south toward the slave markets of Georgia and Alabama. The most chilling aspect of Patty's operation was her ability to maintain relationships with respectable members of the community while conducting her reign of terror. She attended church services, participated in local social events, and even hosted dinner parties at her tavern. Those who knew her socially described her as charming, if somewhat intimidating. They had no idea that the woman serving them tea had likely committed murder that very morning. By 1820, Patty Cannon had assembled a network of accomplices that would make her one of the most feared criminals on the Eastern Shore. Her gang included her son-in-law Joe Johnson, who had married her daughter and become her right-hand man in the kidnapping operation, and a rotating cast of drifters, criminals, and desperate men who were willing to do anything for money. Patty Cannon's criminal empire was built on a simple but horrifying premise. Human beings were commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded at will. Her operation targeted two specific groups: free African Americans traveling through the area and enslaved people who had escaped and were making their way north toward freedom. In both cases, her victims believed they were safe, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare from which few would escape. The kidnapping operation was methodical and sophisticated. Patty's gang would scout the roads leading to her tavern, identifying potential victims days in advance. Free African Americans carrying papers proving their status were particularly valuable targets, as their documents could be destroyed, making it impossible for them to prove they weren't escaped slaves. Families traveling together were especially vulnerable, as Patty knew that parents would submit to capture rather than see their children harmed. The methods used to lure victims were as varied as they were cruel. Sometimes, members of Patty's gang would pose as travelers in distress, asking for help with a broken wagon or an injured horse. When Good Samaritans stopped to assist, they would find themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. Other times, the gang would spread word of job opportunities or safe houses for escaped slaves, drawing desperate people directly to their doom. Once victims arrived at the tavern, they were quickly overpowered and restrained. Patty had converted portions of her basement into makeshift prison cells, with heavy chains and shackles permanently installed in the walls. The conditions in these underground chambers were designed to break the spirit of even the strongest individuals. Victims were given minimal food and water, kept in complete darkness, and subjected to regular beatings to ensure compliance. What happened next depended on Patty's assessment of each victim's value. In the slave markets further south, healthy young men and women would be kept alive and eventually transported to Georgia or Alabama, where they would be sold to plantation owners. Children were particularly valuable, as they represented decades of potential labor. Older victims, or those who posed a risk of escape, would face a different fate entirely. The psychological torture inflicted on victims was perhaps even worse than the physical abuse. Patty would often separate family members, keeping them in different parts of the basement where they could hear each other's cries but couldn't communicate. She would promise freedom to those who cooperated, only to laugh at their naivety. Some victims reported that she would describe in graphic detail what awaited them in the Deep South, taking pleasure in their despair. The transportation phase of the operation was equally brutal. Victims would be loaded into specially modified wagons with hidden compartments, then driven south along back roads to avoid detection. The journey could take weeks, during which prisoners were given minimal food and water. Many didn't survive the trip, and those who did arrive at their destination were often so traumatized that they never fully recovered. What set your spine tingling about what you've witnessed so far? Do you believe there were people in the community who suspected what was happening but chose to remain silent? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how such evil could operate in plain sight for so many years. By 1825, Patty Cannon's operation had evolved from kidnapping into something far more sinister. As law enforcement began to take notice of the unusual number of disappearances in the area, and as some of her victims managed to escape and tell their stories, Patty realized that leaving witnesses alive was becoming too dangerous. It was then that she crossed the line from kidnapper to cold-blooded killer. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Initially, Patty would only resort to murder when absolutely necessary, when a victim proved too difficult to control, when someone threatened to expose her operation, or when the risk of keeping someone alive outweighed the potential profit from selling them. But as time went on, killing became easier, almost routine. Some historians believe she developed a taste for it, finding pleasure in the act of taking a life. The first documented murder took place in the winter of 1825. A free African-American man named Samuel Harrison had been traveling north with official papers proving his status when he was captured by Patty's gang. Unlike other victims, Harrison refused to be broken. He constantly attempted to escape, rallied other prisoners to resist, and loudly proclaimed his free status to anyone who would listen. Patty decided he was too much trouble to keep alive. According to later testimony from accomplices, Patty strangled Harrison with her own hands in the basement of her tavern. She then had his body dismembered and buried in the marsh behind the building. His horse and belongings were sold, and his freedom papers were burned. When Harrison's family came looking for him weeks later, Patty claimed he had never stopped at her establishment. The ease with which he disposed of Harrison seemed to unlock something dark in Patty's psyche. Over the following months, the murders became more frequent and more brutal. Victims who showed signs of illness were killed rather than treated, as Patty calculated that dead bodies were easier to manage than sick prisoners. Elderly captives were murdered simply because they had less value in the slave markets. Perhaps most horrifying were the child murders. When families were captured together, Patty would sometimes kill the children in front of their parents as a form of psychological torture designed to ensure complete compliance. Other times, children would be killed simply because they cried too much or required too much care. The casual nature of these infanticides shocked even her own accomplices, several of whom would later testify against her. Patty developed increasingly creative methods of disposing of bodies. The marshy terrain around her tavern was ideal for this purpose. Bodies could be weighted down and sunk in the bog, where they would decompose rapidly in the acidic water. Other victims were dismembered and buried in different locations to make identification impossible. Some bodies were fed to the pigs that Patty raised behind the tavern, ensuring that no trace of her victims would ever be found. The psychological impact of these murders on Patty herself is difficult to assess. Those who knew her during this period describe her as becoming increasingly paranoid and violent. She would fly into murderous rages over minor slights, and several people reported that she seemed to enjoy recounting the details of her crimes to trusted confidants. Some historians believe she may have been one of America's first female serial killers, driven not just by profit, but by a genuine enjoyment of killing. Thank you so much for staying with this video until this point. We truly appreciate your time and your interest in this dark chapter of American history. We assure you that the most shocking revelations are still to come, and what you'll discover in the remaining chapters will completely astound you. By 1827, Patty Cannon had built what can only be described as a criminal empire. Her influence extended far beyond her isolated tavern, reaching into courthouses, sheriff's offices, and even churches throughout the Delmarva Peninsula. Through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and sheer intimidation, she had made herself virtually untouchable, operated with impunity, while law enforcement either looked the other way or actively assisted her operations. The scope of her corruption network was staggering. Local magistrates would dismiss charges against members of her gang, often without even reviewing the evidence. Sheriff's deputies would provide advance warning of planned raids, allowing Patty to move her prisoners or temporarily shut down operations. Even some clergymen accepted donations from Patty, turning a blind eye to the screams that occasionally echoed from her property during Sunday services. Her gang had grown to include nearly 24 active members, each with specialized roles in the operation. Joe Johnson, her son-in-law, served as her lieutenant, coordinating kidnapping operations and managing the transportation of victims to southern slave markets. Cyrus James, a former overseer, was responsible for breaking resistant prisoners through torture and intimidation. Jesse Cannon, possibly a relative, handled the financial aspects of the operation, laundering money through legitimate businesses and maintaining contacts with slave dealers in Georgia and Alabama. The tavern itself had been extensively modified to accommodate the growing operation. The basement had been expanded into a network of underground chambers, complete with torture devices, and holding cells that could accommodate dozens of prisoners at once. Secret passages connected different parts of the building, allowing gang members to move unseen. The property's outbuildings had been converted into workshops where stolen goods were processed and weapons were manufactured. Patty's reputation for violence had grown to legendary proportions. Stories circulated throughout the region of her superhuman strength and her willingness to kill anyone who crossed her. She was said to have beaten men to death with her bare hands, to have thrown full-grown adults across rooms, and to have tortured victims for days before finally ending their suffering. While some of these tales were undoubtedly exaggerated, enough were true to create an atmosphere of terror that extended far beyond her immediate area of operations. The financial success of her enterprise was evident in her lifestyle. Despite the humble appearance of her tavern, Patty lived lavishly by the standards of rural Delaware. She owned multiple properties, fine clothing, and jewelry that was far beyond the means of a typical tavern keeper. She threw elaborate parties for local dignitaries, always ensuring that her guests left with a clear understanding of her power and influence. Perhaps most chilling was how Patty had begun to view her victims. No longer were they human beings to be exploited for profit. They had become nothing more than livestock in her eyes. She would refer to them using the same terminology that farmers use for cattle or pigs, discussing their condition and breeding potential with the cold calculation of a livestock trader. This dehumanization made it easier for her to commit increasingly brutal acts without apparent remorse. The scope of her crimes during this period is difficult to calculate precisely, as many victims simply vanish without a trace. However, estimates suggest that between 1827 and 1829, Patty's gang was responsible for the kidnapping of over 100 free African Americans and the murder of at least 36 people. The actual numbers were likely much higher, as many crimes were never reported or investigated. The beginning of Patty Cannon's downfall came from an unexpected source. Her own success had made her careless. As her criminal empire grew, so did the number of people who knew about her activities. Eventually, someone would find the courage to speak out, and when they did, the carefully constructed web of corruption and fear that had protected her for so long would finally begin to unravel. The break in the case came in April 1829, when a young African-American man named Cyrus Trader managed to escape from Patty's basement prison. Trader had been captured while traveling north with his wife and infant child, who remained imprisoned in the tavern. His escape was nothing short of miraculous. He had managed to work loose from his chains during a thunderstorm when the noise masked the sound of his efforts, then crawled through a drainage tunnel that led from the basement to the marsh behind the building. Instead of fleeing the area, Trader made a decision that would prove to be Patty's undoing. He traveled directly to the courthouse in Georgetown, Delaware, where he presented himself to Attorney General James Rogers and demanded justice. Rogers, who had long suspected that something was amiss at Johnson's corner but had lacked concrete evidence, finally had the witness he needed to build a case. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Armed with search warrants and accompanied by a large force of deputies, Rogers raided Patty's Tavern on April 11th, 1829. What they found inside would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. In the basement, they discovered 11 African Americans chained to the walls, including Trader's wife and child. The prisoners were in various stages of malnutrition and showed clear signs of prolonged abuse. But the living prisoners were not the most disturbing discovery. As investigators excavated the property, they began uncovering human remains buried throughout the grounds. In the marsh behind the tavern, they found the skeletal remains of at least 4 adults and 2 children. In the basement itself, they discovered a collection of personal effects, jewelry, clothing, and identification papers that had belonged to dozens of missing persons. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of Patty's account book, a ledger in which she had meticulously recorded her criminal activities. The book contained detailed entries describing the capture, sale, and in many cases, murder of her victims. Written in her own hand, it provided investigators with a complete record of her crimes dating back nearly a decade. The casual tone of the entries, describing murder and torture as routine business transactions, provided chilling insight into her mindset. When confronted with the evidence, Patty initially attempted to maintain her innocence, claiming that she was being framed by enemies who wanted to destroy her reputation. However, as more witnesses came forward and additional evidence was uncovered, her story began to fall apart. Several members of her gang, facing their own charges, agreed to testify against her in exchange for reduced sentences. The trial of Patty Cannon was scheduled for May 1829, and it promised to be one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Delaware history. Newspapers throughout the region covered every development in the case, and public interest was intense. However, justice would be denied by fate itself. On May 11, 1829, just 2 weeks before her trial was scheduled to begin, Patty Cannon was found dead in her jail cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by poison, though the source of the poison was never determined. Some historians believe she may have had the substance hidden on her person when she was arrested, while others suspect that corrupt officials provided it to prevent her from implicating them in her crimes. The mystery of her death would never be solved, but her criminal empire died with her. The surviving members of her gang were either executed or sentenced to long prison terms. The tavern at Johnson's Corner was abandoned and eventually demolished, though local residents reported strange sounds and apparitions in the area for decades afterward. The story of Patty Cannon forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for evil that exists within us all. How does an ordinary person become capable of such monstrous acts? Was Patty born with a predisposition toward violence? Or did circumstances and choices transform her into the monster she became? These questions have no easy answers, but they remind us that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs. The most disturbing aspect of Patty's story may be how she managed to operate for so long with the knowledge and even assistance of supposedly respectable members of her community. Her crimes were an open secret among many local residents, yet few found the courage to speak out until it was almost too late. This complicity reminds us that evil flourishes not just through the actions of bad people, but through the silence of good people who choose not to act. What do you think drives someone to become a monster like Patty Cannon? Have you encountered stories from your own family history or local area that remind you of this case? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights help us understand how such darkness can emerge and how we might prevent it in the future. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to receive alerts about more true crime stories that reveal the darkest chapters of American history. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories that remind us of both the depths of human cruelty and the courage of those who stand against it. Don't miss our next video. The Bloody Benders, the family that made entire towns disappear, an even more shocking story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about America's frontier past. Click now to watch this incredible tale of a family whose crimes made Patty Cannon's seem almost tame by comparison.